Hi, everybody. It's your Professor Joseph C. Miller. I'm just giving this a try for the first week. Recording this bad boy right from PowerPoint. We'll see how it goes. But I'm doing this in hopes that you guys stay current with the lesson. I plan to have these up by Monday morning, so this is a kind of a late take. But I'm doing this now because I made a pledge to you that I'm going to support your learning as best I can on this online asynchronous class. First week, we're just going to talk about what consumer behavior is and look at some of the origins of how that kind of science has been derived from what mother disciplines that they take from consumer behavior and what the field of science is actually for. All right, so what is consumer behavior? Basically, that's a set of activities that take place as people go about addressing their real needs, but understand that when they look at what their real needs are, they're trying to look for sources of value. And value can mean different things to different people, right? In other words, people just because they have people might buy generally the same things, they do not necessarily value things in that in the same way from person to person. So for the visionary firm, what you want to really be able to do is to segment the marketplace and be able to get a good target group of customers who typically value things in the same way. So that you can appeal to them with a marketing message that is consistent, and they will basically be able to be attracted to the market offering in the same way, right? So that's basically the idea. And it involves multiple psychological events like how people think about things, right? In other words, when they have thoughts about something, how they process information about things in the marketplace, that's how we describe that as their cognitive ability. In other words, they think about things in a way that's how we describe that is their cognitive processing, right? They'll think about things in a similar way. Also, in addition to thinking, there's two others, right? The second is how they feel about a particular thing, right? In other words, if they have a, pardon me, I just came from outside. I've been coughing a lot. How they feel about something is different than how they think about it, right? In other words, you have a feeling, and that feeling is not really based on how you actually come to any kind of like a mental cognition about that particular thing. You just have a feeling. How we describe that is in affective, right? Affective, not effective, affective with an A, right? Affective, when we talk about like how things affect something else, what we're basically saying is that when they affect a particular environment or an outcome, they change the feeling about it, right? In other words, they affect it, but we don't necessarily have to think about how they affect it. We just know that the feeling of a particular thing has changed. And that's true for consumers as well, right? In other words, they feel a particular way about perhaps a market offering, or they feel a particular way about a brand or something like that. The feeling is different. How you feel about Microsoft is different than how you feel about Apple, right? I mean, there's just a different feeling about it, and we that's different than how we think about it cognitively. It's just the feeling is different, and they've done a good job of separating the feeling of those two companies and so many others. Lastly, it's about how people behave, and behavior, how we describe how they process behavior is in the conative response. The conative response. In other words, how you actually behave on a market. In other words, for a lot of consumer behavior, it's actually the behavior that we're talking about is what you choose to spend money on or what you choose to invest in as a product, right? That's the behavior. How you think about things and how you feel about things is great but that's within your own body. How it affects the marketplace is how actually people behave, right? In other words, what they choose to spend money on. That's a different thing. For me, for instance, I have a tremendous feeling about Porsche automobiles, and I actually, for my entire adulthood, I've just had this absolute great feeling about Porsche automobiles, and that has resulted in me doing a lot of research about Porsche. I think they're just fantastic automobiles. When it comes time for me to buy an automobile, what do? I buy a Toyota, right? And the reason why is because just because I feel a particular way and think about things a particular way does not necessarily affect how I choose to spend money. That's a completely different step as well, right? So that's something that any company who is interested in trying to affect the marketplace, they have to believe as well. The entire process of this, of how you think, feel, and behave about various market offerings illustrates what you value, right? It culminates in value. The process culminates in value. The idea of consumer behavior is that people aren't going to behave in a particular way that's antithetical to what they think, feel, and behave in the marketplace. So people just don't make irrational decisions that way. So the whole entire process of consumer behavior results in an illustration of what people are actually valuing. We've seen this before. If you've taken principles of marketing before, the entire consumption process is one in which you're looking at it here, right? It starts with a need, and basically what we have is what they refer to often as the needs gap. But the difference between what it is you say you want and where you are right now, what you desire and where you are at the moment. There's a gap there. I'm trying to put myself on the camera here. There's a gap there. And so once you recognize that there's a gap, we understand that there's a need. Once we have a need, there are certain things that we want out of this. Perhaps there are certain brands that we desire. There's certain products that we desire to be able to achieve that needs gap, to achieve closing that needs gap, I should say. There's some kind of exchange that takes place, right? In other words, we understand that we have an understanding about the exchange. They're putting a product out there, and we want to be able to obtain that product. What do we need to do? We need to be able to have perhaps a certain amount of money. Perhaps we need to be able to engage in some training. Perhaps we need to be in a position where we have a certain knowledge gap that we want to achieve before we actually buy this thing. That's part of what the exchange is. There's an understanding about the different things that we could buy in terms of the costs and benefits of being able to obtain that thing. There's a reaction, right? In other words, there's the decision about what we actually end up buying. And then lastly, there's a perception of value. Was it actually worth it for us to do this? And now that we have this thing at the end where we have a certain level of value, we go back up at some point to the needs gap, right? When it's time to buy something again. So that's what it is. Consumption, what is that, right? Consumption is the process by which consumers use and transform goods, services, or ideas into value, right? In other words, where we actually use the thing that we actually did all that research about, where we actually, actually choose to actually take part in the process of using the thing that we that we made an investment in, right? That, pardon me. Whew. Consumption involves an interaction between the marketer and the consumer, right? In other words, there's if there's good marketing in a particular company, there's been some kind of contact, directly or indirectly, between the marketers, the people who want to be able to sell products to customers, and the consumers themselves, right? In other words, there's been some kind of interaction that has taken place to be able to get the consumer in a place where they can actually consume. Ideally, and I know that in principles of marketing we discuss this quite a bit. Ideally, the very fact that a consumer chooses to consume a particular product or service or market offering illustrates that consumer is going to be made better off by that consumption. They believe at the point of consumption that the reason that they're using this is because they think that this is going to make them better off in some way, right? The amount of money that they spent, the amount of investment that they spent in order to be able to obtain a good means that by the time they get it and they're in a position to consume that thing, they believe that there's a certain amount of value to having consumed that good, right? And on the other side of it, the company itself that sold it, because they have sold this particular thing at a particular price, they get the money. The company is made better off. So both sides are being made better off here. That's the idea behind consumption, right? As a field of study, where does consumer behavior come from, right? The science of studying how consumers seek value in an effort to address real needs, right? And this is something that any company that does marketing, they have to understand about what the customer's point of view is, because they have to understand what the customer is going to go through in order to obtain the thing that you're trying to sell them. So what is this? What is the where does the discipline come from? Well, it comes from a few places. The first is economics. Typically, we refer to this in terms of macroeconomics. In other words, the idea that there's a large group of people who are trying to make things better for themselves. So a lot of times we think about this in terms of macroeconomics, but don't believe that it's not in terms of microeconomics as well, because the idea that people are trying to to decide on what they want when they have limited resources, that's the idea of microeconomics. That's also important as well, right? What else? We have psychologically, particularly social psychology, right? In other words, things that happen in the social realm of how people think and feel. How they feel in terms of like ideas about group dynamics or culture. That's a big part of what the science of consumer behavior comes from, right? In other words, because so much of marketing is based on trying to drive down people into groups or into sources of culture and subculture. A lot of psychology, uh, social psychology in particularly, is based on that. So a lot of the field of consumer behavior comes from that particular area. Of course, marketing, right? The idea of marketing is that you want to be able to make it so that you maximize the idea of transaction, right? And so when you maximize the idea of transaction, you're trying to drive people down to a particular group so we can speak to that group and make them understand and feel the source of value that we're really trying to offer, and they're gonna be attracted to the message that we're sending them. Anthropology, right? In other words, understanding how people behave in terms of a group dynamic. I should say how people behave in a society, how people typically, um, you know, um, view things that touch their society, like artifacts or messaging or something like that. That's the field of anthropology. So that those are the things that we come from with regard to consumer behavior. These are the another look at it here. Like we have anthropology, economic psychology, and sociology are different areas and sub areas that are based on that. Like for instance, political science, finance, history, management, organizational organizational relations, statistics, neuroscience, and law are things that affect consumer psychology. And this is kind of like a view of what we're doing. All right. All right. We talked about this before. This is the idea that economics affect is a parent of consumer psychology. So economics is the study of production and consumption, and they often focus on that macro perspective of CB, bounded by broad assumptions, meaning that data is derived from like historical sales records. In other words, when we have large data sets, especially in the era of big data, and now moving into artificial intelligence, we have the ability to access very large sets of data. And by understanding those very large sets of data, we can understand what kind of people are purchasing product, what their motivations might be, what their price preferences or price tolerances are, all sorts of data, like geolocation about where people are buying things, all sorts of ideas, the understanding of seasonality. In other words, once we have the ability to look at large sets of data, we can look at things from a macro perspective, a macroeconomic perspective. But understand that what underpins all that macroeconomic perspective is the micro perspective, right? In other words, what individuals might do as a result of the large sets of data that we're able to look at, right? Those studies involve commodity consumption of nations over time. In other words, understanding what entire nations do in terms of buying particular things, tracking changes in consumption with different price levels. In other words, when we manipulate the price, how does that affect how many people would buy a particular good as we mess around with the price? Is it more elastic, where small changes in price mean rather large changes in terms of consumption level, or is it inelastic, where small changes in price really doesn't affect the consumption level at all? All right, so take a look at this. We have what we often refer to one of the leading ways in which we understand, um, how should I say, how we understand how people, different cultures perceive a bundle of goods. One of the more popular and kind of like a pop culture ways of doing that is in terms of the Big Mac Index. We can see here how many people, what the level of people actually buying various bundle of goods like that you find in a Big Mac: two all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, right? We see what people's tolerance is for this by what the prices are for Big Macs over time, right? So we have a 2 year window here. In the United States, it didn't really change too much. China didn't change hardly at all. It actually, matter of fact, went down in price from 2014 to 2016. India went up a little bit. Venezuela dropped tremendously in price, right? I mean, it dropped off a cliff. I don't know what happened there from between those 2 years, but that's a different thing. Norway fell off quite a bit. Switzerland fell a little bit, and South Africa fell a little bit. But you can see here that number one, people pay wildly different prices for Big Macs, but depending on where they live. And number two, you can also see that people tend to there's a lot of change that takes place in a relatively short period of time. Hang on a second. All right. So consumer psychology, another way of thinking about consumer behavior from the purely psychological perspective. So psychology, what is that? That's the study of human reactions to their environment. In other words, looking at how people, how their affective and their cognitive views affect their cognitive approaches to what their things are happening in their environment, right? So social psychology is the study that focuses on the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that people have as they interact with other people, right? And cognitive psychology is the study of the intricacies of mental reactions involved in information processing. So these are the basically the three areas that happen in consumer psychology, right? Looking at how these different applications of psychology really affect how people are acting in the marketplace, right? How they act in the marketplace. Within marketing, and why marketing, any marketing program is going to have a really good study of consumer behavior. So, but marketing, what that is the multitude of value-producing seller activities that make exchanges between buyers and sellers a lot easier. They facilitate those exchanges, including production, right? In other words, how can we make it so that we normalize production that make it so that consumers find it easier to buy the things that we want to buy. An example of that, soft drinks, right? Soft drinks. I think Pepsi Cola was started in Purchase, New York. Coca Cola was started in Atlanta, Georgia. But think about how many Pepsi bottling agents there are from across the country, right? In other words, the ability for people to be able to have easy access to Pepsi Cola, they found that for both Pepsi and Coke, that was a leading market strategy that they needed to be able to employ. So they have Pepsi bottling facilities all across the country and across the world because of the fact that the fact that people want to be able to buy this means that there shouldn't be a central production agency for soft drinks. We should be able to have this stuff produced pretty much everywhere. What's not like that? What's not like that is something like automobiles, right? In other words, we typically, as big as and bulky as automobiles are to ship, we typically don't have a global production of those things. When you buy an F-150, there's like 3 or 4 factories in the world where they make that, maybe even 2 or 3, right? And they ship an F-150. Ford ships F-150s all across the globe because of the fact that even though people want to be able to have easy access to it, the idea that you have to have a certain level of expertise when you create that means that the production has to be confined to a very few number of places, right? Pricing, right? In other words, how do we price a particular good? What factors do we use to make it so that people see the value easily in the pricing that we price, goods and services. How do we do that to make it so that people do not find the price to be an absolute impediment to buying that thing? Promotion, right? What messaging do we want to send out there to the public so that they understand that this product is available to buy, is a viable product to buy, is the product that you should be buying, right? Do we give them literal sales promotions? Do we give them like coupons or something like that? Do we send them a message that when they see this message, they're going to pick up that this is the thing they should be buying? What are the things we should be doing there? And lastly, distribution, right? How do we make it so that the way that we distribute products to people are the way in which we want to actually have them distributed? I'm telling you guys, I'm old enough now to remember in my young adulthood having bought something in the mid 90s on Amazon.com. And I actually got talked to by my boss at the time. She said, listen, you shouldn't be buying things on any Amazon.com, right? Because, no one's going to want to buy things where things are just shipped to your house. That just sounds like a really shady operation. Remember, that was about 30 years ago, right? And look what happened now. I mean, so many people desire to have Amazon.com. So, in other words, the market has totally flipped. Where a referent other, when I was young, told me you should not be buying this thing. And now, I'm still buying it on Amazon.com 30 years later, but so many people have done that, right? So, the idea that, distribution preferences have changed over a short period of time illustrates the fact that, people change. The market can be trained, right? All right. Also, retailing, right? Where do we want to be able to buy particular products? Like, what kind of features of how we want to purchase things are going to be picked up by various retailers? What kind of strategies should retailers use to be able to have people buy products for a particular place? All right. Other disciplines, sociology, the study of groups and people within a society, right? In other words, when you study sociology, that's looking at people and how they behave in various groups, looking at what people's roles are within groups, that kind of thing. That's the study of sociology. Consumption is affected by group dynamics, right? In other words, how people behave in a particular group, how one group might see a particular market offering versus another group. That's the field of sociology. Understanding sociology is important. Anthropology, the field of study involving interpretations of relationships between consumers and the things they purchase, the products they own, the activities in which they participate, right? Oops. But yeah, anthropology, I went through that kind of quickly, but anthropology, the idea here is that, people are going to have a different relationship between themselves and the things that they actually want to buy. The way people buy things, I'll give you a little example. The way people buy things like whiskey in the United States is completely different than the way people buy things like whiskey in Japan. They have a completely different kind of relationship with not only how they buy it, but how they use it, right? All right, so this slide, firm orientations and consumers, right? In other words, understanding how people, how the firm is coming across to consumers. Competition drives companies towards a high degree of consumer orientation, right? In other words, when companies when there's a lot of competition nature between companies, they tend to focus more on the consumers themselves, right? When there's not a high degree of competition, they'll do things like focus on production, or they'll focus on other things. They won't really focus so much on the consumer. But when there's a high degree of competition, they have a big amount of focus on what the customer really wants, right? So a firm's action and decision making prioritize consumer value and satisfaction above all other concerns, right? In other words, when you use a high degree of competition, and in most cases there is a high degree of competition, the main focus of what firms should be doing is what customers would like to see them do, right? You can always tell, like when the economy kind of goes south a little bit, as it might be doing right now, the amount of focus on what customers want tends to go down. You see it. You see it. I mean, look at like how people are getting kind of upset with the service provided in companies like Uber and Uber Eats and DoorDash and things like that. In other words, when the amount of competition kind of goes down, when there's not as much rivalry, there's a lot more concern about how they're going to stay in business. Like like and I don't worry so much about consumers. When you focus on consumers, typically um, you will do things that are perhaps not as economically viable for the company, but you will do things that are that keep the customers around. But when things go south in the economy, you tend to focus on things away from consumers. So that's just what we're kind of looking at right now. Key component of a firm with market orientation, right, is the consumer orientation. We've talked about market orientation. I know that you've done that if you've taken a principles of marketing class. But market orientation is a culture that embodies the importance of creating for value for customers among all employees, and everything that every employee who works for a market-oriented firm is doing is they're doing things to make the customer happy. Ask a person who works as a janitor for a market-oriented company, why are you doing this job the way you're doing it? And the janitor will, if they're market oriented, they'll say, listen, when customers come in here, they want to see a clean, well maintained facility. The customers like it. That's why I do it. That's a market oriented company. So there you are. All right. The idea of a few other forms of firm orientations. The first is stakeholder marketing, right? The idea of stakeholder marketing is that it's not just affecting the customer, but it's affecting every single person that has a stake in that company, right? So it's like like they'll make decisions not just based on the customers, but also everybody who is affected by that company. You have these company towns, and oftentimes they're in the Midwest, right? And they engage in stakeholder marketing. They'll be thinking about the fact that there's I don't know, things like restaurants down the street from the company who depend on the workers showing up there every single day for lunch, right? They'll be thinking about the fact that there are people in the society. They'll be thinking about there's a public school system that is depending on the well-being of that company to be able to keep the schools, running and doing well. That's stakeholder marketing, right? So there's primary stakeholders like customers, employees, owners, suppliers, and recruiting agencies. Secondary stakeholders like the mass media, communities, and trade organizations that they're trying to appeal to, right? Relationship marketing, you know what this is, right? The idea of relationship marketing is that, what you want is you want to be able to leverage branding in such a way that consumers feel as if the company that they're dealing with, they have a relationship, and that relationship is, one in which the consumer sees value over time, and and because they see the value, they continue to buy from companies for a long period of time. A big part of relationship marketing, I don't know if this slide covers it, but basically the idea is consumer lifetime value, the CLT, right? Companies, when they have very good relationships with companies, they can start looking at customers and say, listen, over the course of that consumer's lifetime, they are worth a certain dollar amount to the company because they're going to be able to continue buying over time. And that means a certain amount of money, so that the value of the relationship is brought to the fore. Touch points equal every time that a customer has contact with the company. So there's like direct contacts between the firm and customers. Channels of making contact include what? Phone, email, text messaging, online social network, and face-to-face contact. These are the little touch points that customers will use to be able to get in contact with a company. And every time that there's a point of contact between the company and the customer, there's an opportunity to delight them, right? You could make the customer feel really good that they're a part of the experience of doing business with that brand or that company, because those little points of contact, there's an opportunity to make them very, very happy as a result, right? All right, so why is consumer behavior important, right? Consumer behavior provides an input to business and marketing strategy, right? In other words, When you engage in really good consumer behavior, that's a really good way from the research that comes from our consumer behavior, output. That provides us with some insight into what what consumers are really thinking, right? An input to be able to figure out what the business or the marketing strategy should really be, because the consumers are what kind of dictates that, especially in consumer focused or market oriented companies, right? Consumer behavior provides a force that shapes the society, right? um, yeah, I mean, when there's effective change in the marketplace, or the consumer behaviors do something particularly well, it's going to shape how the society responds to things. Again, I use the Amazon example, right? The fact that people feel differently about how they buy, and what is termed acceptable has changed drastically over time. Over 30 years, absolutely. And if it's 30 years for Amazon, think about how much change there's been over the. We're coming up on 20 years of smartphones. Think about how much change there's been in those 20 years, right? I mean, there's been a lot of change in terms of how we choose to buy things, how we choose to research things, how we choose to have relationship with customers. We're looking at 25 years of social media, right? And the fact that there's so much business input into social media, how we choose to get in contact with customers and with brands and with companies and with brands, it's completely different. So that has absolutely shaped how society behaves. Also, consumer behavior provides an input to making responsible decisions as a customer, right? In other words, as a consumer, we have um, more ability to kind of shape how consumers respond to things, because we have the ability to, companies have the ability to kind of affect and to determine for the customer what would be seen as a responsible action in the marketplace. So, we're able to do that. A few things to think about with regard to marketing strategy and consumer behavior. There's a few theories that exist out there that we'll talk more of as the semester goes by. But the first is resource advantage theory, right? And that basically, resource advantage is a theory that looks at why some companies fail or succeed based on how they typically manage and acquire resources, right? So the success is attained by acquiring more resources and using them to gain physical and intellectual capital advantages. You probably see where we're going here with regard to how consumer behavior itself could be seen as a resource, right? And basically the idea here is that if you have better insights into what consumers really want, that's a resource that you can leverage that could be used as a source of competitive advantage against other companies, right? Product is basically the product that we put on the marketplace is kind of like a valuable bundle of benefits, and how we tend to create and shape that bundle of benefits can be a source of competitive advantage against other companies as well, right? We use a tangible feature of a product that delivers a benefit of consumption. A few characteristics of successful innovations, right? In other words, the idea that we have, when we create new products and services, a few considerations to think about. The first is relative advantage, right? The idea that we have an advantage over other companies that are out there, and there's a relative advantage. In other words, the fact that the people might perceive some particular attribute that we have out there as being more valuable or having a better outcome than the other advantages, right? Of other relative advantages. A good example of this might be like think about like Tesla, right? Tesla is a company that has rather well performing automobiles in terms of like for electric automobiles. And for other companies that are available to us right now, we do not have uh, any company that really makes In terms of performance, very few companies can really match Tesla. There are companies out there that will do it, but they're mainly Chinese, and we have done a good job. Elon has done a really good job of locking them out of our marketplace so far. The second is simplicity. When people see things that are simple, they tend to want to gravitate to that. That, by the way, is one of the things that has made Apple, you're not going to like this, but that has made Apple more desirable oftentimes than Android, especially in the early years, because Android was seen by a lot of people as being more complex, more troublesome, whereas Apple tended to just kind of just work, right? Especially, those in the area of smartphones and tablet computers, they just kind of worked. Android, you had to do a little bit more messing around with, but I think that Android has made a big comeback in the last 8 or 9 years, but still, that's one of the characteristics of really successful innovations is simplicity. The next one is observability, right? In other words, you can easily see by looking at it how something works or how something might work, especially in your own life. So, like when you go on Amazon and look at a product that you're thinking about buying, when they have a really good video of someone using the product, and you can clearly see how it's supposed to be used before you actually have the product in your own house, that's observability, right? And observability makes it so that people have an understanding about how things might be working when they have it. Trialability is your ability to try something before you fully commit to it, right? In other words, taking something out for a test drive before you actually fully commit to that thing. You can try it out for a little while. And there's no implication of actually having to actually commit to it fully. And consistency, the idea that every time you use something, it's going to give you a consistent result. The inputs that you put in are going to give you a consistent output. And so every time that you put something into it, you have an understanding of what you're going to get out of the process, right? All right. I'm not going to go through this too much, but this is basically looking at different forms of how we can actually use a product to be able to appeal to maybe one segment of people. That's a undifferentiated marketing strategy, right? In other words, like we just, for undifferentiated product strategy, we're just trying to appeal to everyone. For a differentiated marketing strategy, we have different products that we're trying to appeal to different segments, right? In other words, there's different market offerings that we put out there that are similar in use, but because people might see the product differently, we have different, different segments. A good offhand, I'm trying to think of an example of that. Yeah, so there is a watch company out there called Seiko, right? Seiko makes pretty nice watches, but they also used to have a company called Pulsar, right? Seiko and Pulsar were the same company, right? But they had good-looking watches, but the Pulsar ones were a little bit less expensive and they were a little more uh, everyday watches, where Seiko watches were fine quartz watches. Well, those are different segments that they're trying to appeal to. They have very similar looking products between Seiko and Pulsar, but they made it so that people, they had different segments that they were appealing to. Niche marketing is where we have a particular product that we're trying to appeal to a small number of people that we really have a good understanding of, right? So if, you know, we understand how people respond to this particular thing. So like if you have a company like, what is it? Vision Streetwear, right? Vision Streetwear. A long time ago, they were just made for like people who did like, they were a part of like youth oriented skateboard culture. That was a niche market, right? But they created a very strong brand, Vision Streetwear, based on the fact that they were trying to appeal to this niche group of people, right? So there you go. Few effects of consumer behavior with regard to society, right? Consumer behavior creates the society one lives in and serves as an essential source of input for public policy. In other words, how because consumer behavior exists, it does a good job of formulating and creating, consumer culture, right? And there's different ways in which people actually behave in a consumptive marketplace. And because of that, we have the ability to shape kind of public policy and how we should actually behave towards guiding the public, right? Consumer behavior topics that can enlighten customers include what? Consequences of poor budget allocation, right? In other words, the fact is that in order to have a healthy consumer culture, they have to have the ability to buy things. And so you want to be able to look at the consequences of people when they behave poorly. One thing I should have wrote on that decision board about current things that are happening in the area of consumer behavior, I should have wrote about the fact that there are so many companies that are auto dealerships who, during the pandemic, they behaved terribly, right? They would sell automobiles for way over the MSRP price because they could, right? Because there were fewer, there were fewer cars being created because of the pandemic itself. And so they tried to make it so that they would charge just abnormal, exorbitant rates. But now some of those people want to be able to sell their cars and get the latest edition of automobile, but they can't because they're underwater. They sold so many cars at such a high, exorbitant rate that so many people are underwater trying to pay for these cars. They owe way more than the cars are worth. So now the auto industry is really in trouble. I don't know if you know this, but they're really in trouble. There's so many automobile dealerships coast to coast that cannot sell cars because of the way that they behaved before. So that's a consequence of encouraging people to use poor budget allocation to buy automobiles that were overpriced. So now they can't sell cars. Then there's cheap people like me who would not pay those prices. I typically buy 10-year-old cars and just drive them. And I'm not going to buy. I could certainly afford it, but I'm not going to do it. And there's a lot of people like me too. So that's I'm not going to fall to the consequence of a poor budget allocation. The role of emotions in decision making, right? In other words, the fact is that you can really look at how people have an emotional response to when they buy things. They feel like the thing that they buy. There's an emotion that's tied up in it. They feel a certain amount of pride, or perhaps they feel a certain amount of loyalty when they buy a particular thing. That's an emotional response. And the fact is that a lot of companies will leverage that. Social influences on decision making, right? In other words, the fact is that for so many of us, we buy things that we think our friends would like us to buy, or we think our family would like us to buy, right? You buy things not based on the cognitive processing, you buy things on the social influences. In other words, someone of my position, because I'm in this friend group or because I'm from this family, I think that someone of my position would buy this particular brand of whatever it is, and they buy that not based on the processing of any idea, but just based on their social influences, right? The environmental effects on consumer behavior, right? Think here about the fact that there's so much fashion now is like like if you buy things, what's the name of the store? I've forgotten it, but there's so many companies out there, retailing companies. They sell clothing at very cheap prices for like very fast fashion, right? But because they do this, there is so much more waste that is going on because of the fact that we typically sell products to be used of the moment, right? There's retailing operations that they refresh their lineup every 3 weeks, as opposed to every season, and because of that, they throw a lot of things out, and that there's an effect here. There's an environmental effect on that kind of consumer behavior that they've trained us to engage in. There's a lot of avenues for seeking redress or for unsatisfactory purchases, right? In other words, there's a lot of ways now that consumers take revenge for when they buy things and the thing has not, lived up to its billing. A lot of it will involve like social media. There's a former student of mine back in New York when I was there. She is just an expert at whenever she buys anything that is, like unsatisfactory in some way. She is just really on social media, letting everybody know. She's always like putting companies on blast and that kind of thing. And at first I was like, "Oh man, for real?" But now I realize that this is something that a lot of people do. I mean, they've before companies were kind of, I'm sorry, consumers were kind of over a barrel But now, not so much, right? They don't, that's kind of the difference now. I'm not going to do the slide on interpretive research because I, uh, this is something that we're going to talk about all through the term. But basically, the idea here is that you use research to figure out what consumer behavior, what consumers feel about various things. They use a lot of tools for doing this, and we could include case analysis, clinical interviews, and focus group interviews. I'm sure you know about that stuff. More interpretive research, a few things that we can use. Phenomenology, in other words, we look at a particular phenomenon and we look at how people respond to a particular phenomenon when it happens. A matter of fact, I did this, right? When I was a grad student, my dissertation was on the idea of when employees would go above and beyond and how consumers would respond to that, right? In other words, whenever there was a service worker who went above and beyond in when consumers were trying to buy something, how people responded to that. And that going above and beyond was a phenomenon, and we were looking at that. Ethnography is the idea that we're trying to look at how people within a particular subgroup of people relies on an interpretation of artifacts to draw conclusions about how people consume things. More quantitative customer research is where we look at numerical measurements. So, like when we look at like scanner data and look at how people bought things, that's a form of quantitative consumer research. Quantitative consumer research is when basically we look at numerical measurement. We just look at the pure number. And because we're looking at the number of things, how many units we sold, what the price was, when the dates were, and so forth, we can look at things from a more measured approach and not a qualitative approach. We look at things from a numerical perspective because it's not qualitative and it's based on numbers. It's not researcher dependent. In other words, how people might use to interpret when they're a researcher in qualitative research. It's not so much that way in quantitative research. People, the numbers are the numbers, and it enables researchers to better test hypotheses and doesn't require a whole lot of deep interpretation. I'll leave this here. You can look at different forms of like qualitative versus quantitative research, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the course of the semester. Consumer behavior is dynamic, right? When we come to things like internationalization, right? In other words, when we're looking at companies that has to deal with putting a product and making it global, looking at how companies have to kind of like look at how they have to change orientation when they make international appeals, when they try to move a product and make it available in some other country or some other part of the world. They're going to have to deal with geographical distance and cultural distances as well, right? In other words, the idea that we're going to have to make adjustments to be able to make things appealing to people in other cultures. People from different cultures interpret products and behaviors differently. You knew that. Customer perception will determine the success or failure of the product. So many examples out there of companies that internationalized that did not do the requisite amount of research into how people perceive things in different cultures, and they make just tremendous faux pas. Technological advances have made geographical distance a non-issue, right? And like the fact that the internet exists, we have the ability to appeal to people in very long distances. We don't have to really be on site as much. What we have to be able to do is to make sure that we're appealing to them in the right way over a long distance, but not necessarily that we have to appeal to them. That we have to be on site. The era of big data, we've already talked about this, but basically, like there's so much more data that's out there than we've ever had access to before. But the problem now is that, we want to be able to make it so that the data is tractable, number one. And we need to know what data we really need because the amount of spurious or inconsequential data is also at an all-time high. So we want to know what we need to be able to make a key performance indicator that's really going to be important, right? Predictive analytics shows that we use statistical tools to look at the patterns in the data that allow prediction of what consumer behavior will be. In other words, we use a whole bunch of data to look at what would happen if we cut the price or increase the price. How would that affect the amount of numbers that people bought, or what would happen if we moved this to a particular, this product to a particular location? What would happen if we opened a branch of a particular, you know, retail operation to this area, right? So, that's just what predictive analytics is. The changing economy, the idea that there's a lot of factors contributing to a stagnant income. We're looking at that, more and more of late because that we obviously have a changing economy. I think that that's pretty clear over the last year or so. There's been a lot of external factors that have made it so that we have definitely a changing economy, and we'll see how it turns out, but we'll see. Um, but here's a few factors that lead to kind of stagnant income: unemployment, limited prospects in the workforce, decreased opportunity to work at an acceptable wage, and consumers being cautious about house expenses and react favorably to price cutting policies. All right, I think I'm going to cut it for me for right now. I've been going for about 50 minutes. And the rest of the slides are just more ancillary stuff. Give them a look and give the book a read. I am going to have another video up on by Monday morning, but I just wanted to get you guys kind of started. So I will talk to you soon.